No fa no ba na wanika ne mo ye. Plantain Corinto bi awolo yitokome. Buku ni di nyonwa enyo kepawe. Shimon jene pa sha ni ile. Nyonwa hala. Koni ekawo ni ne loela ahegbele. Ni jene nkoto mo ni ile hu nyonwa hala. Koni ekawo ni hewale ahegbele. Amen.
Amen.
Now, you are in question, you go up there, or the bishop is a foot in it. Now, you are in the oil, no, you go up there, or the bishop that oil in it. Amen.
Amen. But God had chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things that are mighty. Amen. Now, the book of Corinthians was written by the Apostle Paul to the church of Corinth. The church of Corinth was a young and struggling church in the city of Corinth that today is located somewhere around Turkey, thereby. Now, the city was a mega city in those days, and the city was a coastal city, so it had two ports or two huge seaports where travelers and traders on the sea, would end up and dock at their destination. So it shows clearly that a church or a strong Christian church in the city of Corinth would have influenced many people, because the city was a mega city, it was a trade center, it was an international route for traders and for travelers in those times. However, though the church of Corinth was young, it was riddled with many problems. In fact, there is a book I read some time ago that is entitled The Corinthian Catastrophe. The Corinthian Catastrophe. And in fact, the Corinthian church is not, to a large extent, shouldn't be a model church. Looking at the descriptions the apostle wrote about the church and the reports he had heard. So you see that in the church of Corinth, there were many things and many unchristian things that were happening in the church. For instance, there were factions and there were divisions in the church. There were people in the church who said, well, I belong to either Apollos group, or I belong to Paul's group, or I belong to any other group or faction that has come up. Then there was also immorality, a huge sense of immorality and abnormal sexual behaviors that was happening in the church. Being a mega city should imply that their faith and their religion was practiced. In those times, there was lots of idols that were worshipped, and they had temple prostitutes, and there were people who regarded themselves as Christians who used to attend to those places. The church also had some form of misguided understanding of Christian freedom, and then also a misunderstanding on meats offered to idols. They also had issues about the worship or worship forms, or Christian worship forms, and orderliness in Christian worship. In fact, when you read 1 Corinthians chapter, from the chapters 11 to the chapters 14, you will see that the church had lots of misunderstanding when it comes to orderliness in Christian worship. They are those people who would go to church, and then, as we have it today, it's interesting, where they are to pray, and then there are diverse people speaking in tongues, which were unknown languages in the first mention, or going by the first mention principle. But this church were doing anything and everything and mixing everything up together. So we see that from the chapters 11 to 14, the apostle addressed that issue. Also in chapter 15, we see the apostle addressing the issue about the resurrection. In fact, again, the church misunderstood the resurrection. They felt that those who were alive, when Jesus returns, only those who were alive would get to be with him, and that those who were dead would have missed it. But we see that generally, Paul the apostle, in his letter to the church of Corinth, was described the issue of Christian identity and Christian living by contrasting the wisdom of the world as against the wisdom of God. Nyame patre ne se akenkan kawuma ana ewuma Paul etrodi man Korintofo ana Kristofo a omo wo Korinto na samre no na Korinto eye oman kese a ebempoa no enti na nkofo bebre kɔ saman no so na emom entiase ne se anka Kristofo a wo saman no omo wo gidie no mu ntiase a anka nipa dodo na eba kro no mu a ekɔ no omo nso betie nyame asɛmpa no na omo de akɔ omo fie ana omo bebi omo fie ba na emom asɔre na nkasa no na omo ni ntiase efa nyame somu na omo aye ekuokuo edikuo we dikuo eti we nso dikuo eti na ebi mo nso no na omo asetena ana se eba no titie pa na ebi ni ho morality na ayese aye adwojo na ebi mu ni ntiase bebre efa nyama bebre hu we nu munti na Paul etro saa huma edima asafo no na obehu uhwa obehu se hyensude enti a Paul tro saa ehuma no na opese omunti Kristo sumase ene se uye Kristoni a eden hyensude ana eden obra ene sese wobo se eba no nyame enti ase ni ewiase enti ase. So we briefly look at the text again, and I'll refer us again to 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 24. In fact, this text alone should tell us about the attributes of God and should tell us about the depravity of man. And from this text, we are going to look at the topic, the seemingly foolish choices of God. The seemingly foolish choices of God. Let's look at the text again. He said, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And God had chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things of the mighty. Let's look at it again. It says, but God. The word but in English term and in literacy term to a large extent negates some statements that have been done or previous statements. So we see here the term but God. It shows to a large extent the sovereignty of God, to the extent that regardless of the statements that have been done, regardless of the preliminary statements that have been done, and here my key reference will be in the verse 24, where Paul mentions the Jews and the Greeks. The Jews looking for a sign as a means to God's salvation, and the Greeks seeking after wisdom as a means of salvation. However, the text says that, but God. So here we see the sovereignty of God, the almightiness of God, the powerfulness of God, his omnipotence as work, and his will and his sovereignty showing. He said, but God had chosen. Again, we see the choice of God at work. God chooses. And to a large extent, there are many people who will tell us that God is unjust. There are many people who will say God is unfair by the nature of God when it comes to the choice of God. My friends, God has a choice, and God chooses his own. His own belongs to him, and his own will come to him at the end of the day. So we see the sovereignty of God at work in the text. We also see the choice of God at work in the text. It says, but God had chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. We also see the nature of man in this text. The nature of man, the apostle places the nature of man in two categories: the foolish and the wise. The foolish and the wise. The wise here presenting themselves as those who are noble, who know it all, who would want to see a sign or would want to see some wisdom at work. However, it is God who chooses the base things or the foolish things of this world. And then it continues and says, and God had chosen the weak things to humans, but rather these things don't Adam.